Regime change in Iran. Echoes of the past, risks for the future. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ainsley Insights, brought to you by Ainsley.com.au, the home of Ainsley Bullion, Ainsley Crypto, Ainsley Wealth, and the Gold and Silver Standard. Be sure to have a look. Today, welcome a very special guest for his Insights debut. Ben's here. He's actually going to be in our Gold Coast office, which is opening very soon. So it'll be very exciting for people who want to go visit him down there. But for the moment, he's up here with us in Brisbane. And he's just been very interested in what's going on in the Middle East. It's something that he's passionate about, has a lot of information about, does a lot of research on. So it's great to get him here today to be able to have this conversation because it's a bit of a touchy one. It's difficult to get an unbiased view. Ultimately, I want to know how it's going to impact our investments, what we can sort of expect for the future. But it's just wonderful to have you here. So thank you, Ben. Thanks for joining us. And how are you going today?
I'm good, thank you. And thank you very much for having me, Mr. Tipu. It's my pleasure.
It's been something I've been wanting to do for a little while, ever since you've sort of been around discussing this stuff. Look, as I was just saying, it's a tricky topic. When you talk about the Middle East, when you talk about the conflict that we just went through, the escalation in that conflict between Israel and Iran, it's very polarizing. There's strong views on both sides. There's a lot of history here. And I think for people like myself who don't really know all that history, it can be a little bit tricky to decipher what's going on, particularly when you look at what we saw over the last few weeks and what's potentially going on now and ahead. So can you start us off today with a big picture? What's the current situation as you see it between Iran and Israel? Has anything really changed since that recent escalation?
So yeah, right now we're in a bit of a state of an uneasy ceasefire. Even today, Iran just came out to say that they have serious concerns about Israel's commitment to that. So it's tumultuous times, but it does seem to be that the ceasefire is holding. But one of the bigger things is that even though there is now peace in the Middle East, at least for the time speaking, Israel's side hasn't stopped talking about this mysterious regime change that has been thrown around a little bit. So that's one of their long-term goals, and it's something they've been very vocal about. And then recently, we also saw not too long ago Trump also echoing that. So that's one of like the key topics that I think added context and added history, like you said, will help everyone to understand what that actually means going forward, what that could mean for a new Middle East regime change in Iran, what that could look like.
And I know this is something that has always been controversial because, particularly when you talk about the US and regime changes, they have been responsible for a lot of these in
Quite a
history,
couple, yeah.
and how it works out is not always the way they intend for it to work out. And as you can imagine, I mean, you think in our Australian context, if we were suddenly to have a new government, it's going to turn everything on its head. So if you've got the president making posts about changing the regime, is that a signal that that's something they actually are wanting to do? Is it just Trump being Trump, where he often likes to throw these things out there and see what lands? How did you actually view that particular
So
talk?
it was incredibly interesting to see Trump kind of also back Israel's claim of a regime change because at least from my perspective, what I've been seeing for the longest time is Israel pushing for a regime change and not really hearing anything or like sort of like, oh, we don't actually want that. We just want stability, whatnot. Because of course, like you said, regime change comes. Who knows what comes after that? But recently, we saw Trump's tweet or on Truth Social where he said, if Iran can't make itself great again, we will make Iran great again. And regime change is the way to go forward. I'm paraphrasing there, but that's pretty much what he said. Now, is that Trump just being Trump? Very well could be. Because like after that, he just called for the ceasefire and he seems to be kind of supporting the idea of keeping that regime in there. But we need to look more about why or what it is that Iran has been doing historically with regime change, or how that's been imposed on them. Because historically speaking, the US has either been directly involved in regime changes in Iran, or they have just sat there and just waited to see what happens. But they've never like really been wish-washy like they have here. So it's very interesting to see. But from my perspective, I think that Trump is, just playing the game at the moment. But it's interesting to see that outward US support at the moment for a regime change.
So, what does that look like from the research that you've done for people actually in Iran? How do they think about that? Is it something that you've got parts of the population very keen for, that they go, well, we don't want to be under the existing regime. We want a new government. We want a new system. Is it something that has widespread anger? Because you certainly see a lot of protest footage. You see a
100%.
lot of imagery that seems to imply people are very happy with the regime they have, but then you read lots of things saying that they're not. How do you view that?
So most of the viewers would be aware of how a couple of years ago there was huge protests in the diaspora and in Iran against the regime for a lot of the things that were happening over there. So the public sentiment for the regime has been very, very anti-regime for a long time. Interestingly enough, though, with Israel's attack on Iran, there's been that sentiment has grown a lot with a lot of people because they're just fighting for regime change, and they've noticed that no matter how many times they try to do it internally, they can't do it. So they're kind of happy for that external help. But on the flip side, it's taken the people that were in the middle, and half of them have gone to the side of, okay, there's a country attacking our country, so let's back our regime for the moment being. But then the other half are like more strongly now going, no, this is the time for regime change. We've been trying to get this regime out for 30 years. They've been trying to get rid of the current regime. So it is extremely polarizing. They are quite split, but which is something that Israel will have to work with, because regime change, as much external help as they can give, it has to come internally. So yeah, it's very polarizing at the moment in Iran to ask, are you for or against it? Because a lot of people are actually upset about the ceasefire, which is interesting. You think a ceasefire will make people happy. But no, some people are upset. The other people are like, okay, well, the bombing stopped, and they're complacent with it. So it is extremely wish-washy there as well at the moment.
So for people like myself who really don't have a lot of background of that deeper history,
Mhm.
this isn't something that's particularly new in the Middle East. I mean, we know there's been conflict in the Middle East for as long as anyone can remember, and historically there has been a lot going on. What are some of the things that led us to the current regime? Is there something we can learn from that history potentially?
Yeah, 100%. So if we look at the last 100 years of Iran's history, the modern history of Iran, ever since 1941, there's been foreign interference with the Iranian governments and how Iran governs itself. It starts in 1941, where we had Reza Shah was currently the king of Iran, and he was forced to abdicate by the British and Soviet forces then, so that they could get a better control of the oil supplies. And then after the Second World War ended in 1953, again the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, he was overthrown by the CIA. Well, he was overthrown by a military coup, but it has come out in the last 10 years that was all CIA and MI6 backed. Operation Ajax was the name of that, and all those documents show how extensive their involvement in that was. And the US always kind of said that they weren't involved, but now it's come out that they were extremely involved. So that's another thing that happened. And then, of course, we had the 1979 revolution, which maybe didn't have the amount of involvement, but definitely had the West cooperating with who is with the current regime to get them in and to take out Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Um, and that again was for another plethora of reasons. But as you can see, in the last 100 years, there's been a lot. It's a very loaded concept, regime change in Iran, because it always happens kind of externally, and then these new thoughts and these new cultures are just imposed on us, and these new interests are taking away from Iranian interests. So that's kind of where the context of it is. There's of course more that can be said about all of those things, but generally speaking, that's how it's been happening for the last 100 years.
So does that mean that in the case of Israel here, they are pushing for that, or are they still pushing for that as a priority after the recent sort of ceasefire? Is it something that they go, well, okay, the ceasefire is what we're actually wanting to achieve, or do you think there is still that objective of a broader regime change from their perspective?
I think there definitely is that perspective of wanting the broader regime change. Because if we just look at the current regime in Iran, they're extremely anti-West. They call America the big Satan and Israel the little Satan, and this has been going on since 1979. They've been very committed to the fact of hating Israel. So if Israel is always going to look at them and want the regime change, because they're their biggest competition in the Middle East, at the end of the day, they do not like them at all. So I wouldn't be surprised if they're still trying to do covert operations, or in some way still push for that regime change, still push to support the internal opposition to the regime, which is the people of Iran, to start an uprising. It makes complete sense that they would from their perspective. But yeah, it's definitely something that I think they're going to be pushing for still.
Do you think, if we think about the US here, obviously I'm actually very curious about what happened because it certainly came out, but this is not unlike Donald Trump to be sort of saying, look, I solved it because he sort of put himself in the middle of it. How much of that was actually driven by him? How much of it he might have just sort of thrown it out there that there was a ceasefire and everyone sort of just fell into line? I'm
Yeah.
not sure. Like there's many ways you could view that. But do you think ultimately the US's objective is more that stability angle? So if you're saying Israel, they probably do want that regime change. Does the US sit differently on that? And I suppose the follow up part of that for me would be what would it actually look like if they were to achieve that? Because I imagine that's quite risky. So is that what the US will be thinking, going, well, we're trying to balance the risks here?
Well, I suppose the US would be looking at, the predecessors of regime change in the Middle East, which is like Iraq, Libya, even Syria now. We see how that's all changing. Um, Regime change is never going to come with that stability. I think US and Trump is aware of that. That's why he didn't outrightly call for that and then hinted very in a big way towards that with his post. Um, but yeah, I think they're extremely wary of it because they're not in the direct line of fire of the, really affected by Iran. It's just something, a voice shouting all the way in the Middle East. But the big thing is, of course, the oil supply. So they want that stability more than anything. And I suppose it would be good for them if they had more control of the regime, but that's way easier said than done. So just advocating for a regime change from a US perspective that is so far away and so unaware of the Iranian zeitgeist is something that I think they're not looking towards doing. Definitely not to the extent that Israel is. Because again, like I said, Israel's the one that's more directly affected by this current regime, and they would be the ones that would directly benefit from a regime change. And now, how that would look as well, again, all those examples like Iraq and Libya, two big ones, no one could have predicted, especially Libya. Like, where's Libya now compared to where it was? Um, it's a very risky game to play. You could have a completely destabilized Iran with a bunch of factions showing up, a bunch of extremist groups and a bunch of radical groups just kind of fighting with each other and creating even more distress in the Middle East. But maybe from Israel's perspective, that's better than what they currently have. But I think from the US perspective, they want that stability more than anything. So yeah, I think that's how they're looking.
I think that's a really balanced way that you've looked at all this. So you're providing those different perspectives. It does make sense. It's making a lot more sense to me than it did before about how this all fits together. I suppose that can then lead me to the thing that, selfishly I want to know, and I'm pretty sure a lot of viewers do as well, is how we think about this from a financial perspective. Because when you look at the markets, they have been very unpredictable, well, seemingly very unpredictable during this period of time. If you look at traditionally when there was a war of this nature or anything even remotely like it, you had big crashes in the share market. We're seeing share markets around the world breaking all-time highs at the moment. However, gold has been just absolutely off and racing. So it feels like there's multiple perspectives playing here, whether it's the debt stuff that we always talk about, saying, well, that's important. Oil maybe isn't like the price of oil did not move through that whole war like we would have expected in previous conflicts. It
Yeah.
was very mundane. You would, if you were just looking at that, you wouldn't know anything was even going on.
Yeah.
What's your view on that? Like, how do you see what we should be thinking about in terms of the markets when we look at this sort of tension that's going on currently?
I think geopolitical tensions like this are always going to add uncertainty into the energy markets. But you're right to mention that oil, we didn't really see it affected. That's primarily because we didn't see Iran really touch that aspect of things. They didn't block the Strait of Hormuz. They didn't make threats on that regard. They didn't really speak out loud about it. If they did, then we would have, seen the bigger effect of all that. We've seen people racing or countries racing to, change oil supplies or whatnot. But we didn't really see that, which was very interesting. And I think there's reasons for that. That could be a whole video of their own about why Iran hasn't touched the Strait of Hormuz yet. But all this instability is always going to affect the pricing. Like I said, the trade routes as well. So that's another thing that's in the mix, and obviously investor sentiment as well there. Historically speaking, though, when the tensions escalate, um, it's always safer for investors to turn to things like gold and silver. Uh, at the end of the day, in tumultuous times like this, where we're not sure what's happening in the Middle East, why is gold reacting the way it did? Well, because it's tumultuous. Well, because it's all this uncertainty and instability. Even though it's not technically directly affected, Iran's not a huge supplier of gold, Israel's not a huge supplier, but all that uncertainty, all that talk about World War III, this and that, it's always going to create this huge kind of public sentiment that, like, we need to be safe. So always putting your money into hedges against all of that, like gold, is just the safest thing that I see the public doing, or you can see that reflection in the market as well.
And you do have insight into that, sitting, in the customer service role at Ainsley. You see that, you see people, why they're buying and what motivates them at different times. And you certainly saw that over the last couple of weeks. But sort of to wrap this up, I know some people will go, oh, look, I'm not interested in all this Middle East stuff. It's all just noise. It's, the geopolitical, you can never predict it, all of that. I get that. But I still think personally it's important to have a little bit of knowledge of what's going on, because you are making decisions with your money that can be impacted like by all the things you just mentioned. So to wrap this up, do you have any sort of final thoughts or ideas about your angle on that, your perspective on what people should be watching and why it's important?
Well, I think it's extremely important, at least from an investor's perspective. Like, what should you be looking at? I think particularly cyber attacks. I feel like that's maybe a way that this could escalate without it breaking out and the ceasefire falling fully again. Again, the Strait of Hormuz is going to be a huge thing, whether that's played around with or if the whole thing reignites again. You need to keep an eye out and see how that all goes, because like we just spoke before as well, gold's always going to tend to perform well in uncertain environments. So that's why it's relevant to all of our viewers to keep an eye on this and keep it seeing how it goes. It's also just a general theme of uncertainty and instability in the Middle East. And, we've been hearing about the Middle East for ages. So keeping an eye on that and what's happening there between the two biggest players at the moment, which is Israel and Iran, is extremely important. And it's going to be indicative of how the market moves or what direction it could move. So staying well informed, I think, is the best way to go forward. And again, with those things, cyber attacks, with if the escalation continues, or the Strait of Hormuz is the biggest one.
Look, it's something in Australia, we're so far away from this, it is easy just to ignore it all and say, that doesn't impact us, but it potentially does, particularly if things do escalate. Look, really appreciate your deep dive on that. You've got so much knowledge and information. You're so interested in it. It's wonderful to have you on talking to us. We'll definitely need to get you back again. Thanks for your work on that today, Ben.
That's all good. Thank you for having me.
Thanks everyone for watching. We'll chat again soon.